So this year marks the centenary of the First World War, and yet all of the commemorations that are being held have caused some controversy within certain historians arguing about whether the way we're commemorating is right or not. What has been the debate? What's the debate like within academia about the way the public is commemorating these events?
Well, historians, of course, have been debating the origins and nature of the First World War ever since it took place. It's in the last 25 years that academic historians have revised our understanding of the war to appreciate that it was essentially a popular war in which everyone took part.
We see it's interesting because obviously the popular conception of the First World War at this minute in time is that it was a futile loss of life, and that it's what Michael Gove, I believe, called a Blackadder view of history. How reflective is this of the historical consensus at this minute in time?
All wars are futile in that they do involve loss of life. We're seeing that today, but this war is no exception. What we have in the Blackadder view of the First World War is a distillation in some ways of all the images that accumulated around the First World War in the last, in about 75 years. And in some ways that's inspired historians to go back and re-examine those myths, you might call it, of the war, the cultural memory and cultural history of the war, and see what actually was taking place at the time.
I mean, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the findings of the British Council. They did a survey at the beginning of the year looking at public knowledge about the First World War, and they found that there was obviously very good knowledge of the Western Front, but about 34% of people didn't know that the Middle East was involved in the First World War. 21% didn't know Asia was involved. Does something like that, does a finding like that surprise you in any way?
Doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me at all. I think the focus of popular perception of the war has been on the fallen of the Western Front, and therefore we've lost sight of the fact this was a world war, a global war. It involved campaigns in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. It involved war at sea, equivalent to that in the Second World War. It involved the mobilization of home fronts and popular participation in the war.
But what would you say the public's knowledge of the war actually is?
I think that the public is aware that there was a First World War because they're very engaged with the Second World War. But understanding the nature of that conflict, why that conflict came about, the consequences it had, is very weak, and we should expect that 100 years later. This is 4, 5 generations in some cases detached from the First World War. Many people growing up now, of course, did not grow up with First World War veterans and did not have that personal contact, which does inform people about events in the past.
But why do you think, I mean, one of the very interesting things about the First World War is the fact that we are having these massive commemorations, but why do you think the First World War is still with us? Why is it still within our memory? Because we do not commemorate other wars in this way. We don't have, I doubt very many people know much about the Boer War or have that many commemorations. So what is it about this war?
World War I was a different sort of war. It was a mass war in which everyone played a role. Many men, of course, put on military uniforms, joined a citizen army in this country for the first time and went and fought. But the women they left behind, the men who left behind in the factories, also had a role in the war. And in that respect, it was a different phenomenon to the wars that Britain was fighting before, which are small colonial conflicts as they were. Wars in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, which we fight today, which don't really touch the fabric of society at home.
But do you think, because one of the things that I noted when I was growing up and would study history at school, is that I don't feel that when it came to studying things like the First World War or even the Second World War, it was often treated almost in isolation. It was never viewed in relation to the colonial wars. Do you feel that there is now a better or less understanding of the colonial aspects of it?
I think we don't appreciate that this is a global imperial war. It's not just Britain that goes to war, it's the British Empire as it existed in 1914. In fact, the First World War allowed the British Empire to expand to its greatest extent. And in fact, the Middle Eastern British Empire is, as it were, the origins of the troubles we're seeing in the Middle East at the moment. So in that respect, the First World War and the outcome of the First World War is still determining geopolitics today.
But do you think the war still matters to people today? Do you think it's relevant to today's world? I mean, you've just mentioned obviously there are wars in the Middle East, but how does that, I mean, that could be cited. There's a number of reasons for why those wars exist. Does the actual war itself still matter to modern people, and should it?
It's hard to say whether the actual events of 1914-18 make any difference to people. What matters is that their ancestors were part of that war. This is how people engaged with the First World War, by tracing their grandfather's war experience. Only when they've understood what their forebears did in the conflict do they get an interest in the wider conflict, what it was about, how it was fought, what its consequences were.
But what kind of responsibility do you see the academia having to play when it comes to raising public knowledge on things? I mean, there's always a relationship between, for example, you put on the TV, there will be certain historians who come from an academic background who are on TV informing, but what's the responsibilities do you think historians and academics have towards the public in relation to this?
Oh, I think historians' role essentially is to inform, but also to clarify, to develop proper understanding of the war, to actually show people that what they think they know about the First World War might be a rather narrow perspective, might be a myth, might be based on false assumptions made essentially by the people who lived through the war and couldn't see the war in great perspective. We dwell on the Poets' War. One small group of individuals left a cultural perspective of the war. The historians' war essentially is based on the arguments that, not in fact the principles that the generals and the politicians had about the conduct of the war at the time and the memoirs they wrote afterwards, and that has informed, as it were, the arguments that historians have today. Sorry.
But on the historical question, I mean, one of the things that seems to come up again and again, and has been coming up in the last few months, is, was this war avoidable?
Well, yes, all wars are avoidable. The issue really is, why did the war break out in 1914 in these circumstances? The societies of early 20th century Europe were warlike, and they had the potential to go to war over something at some time. Europe was not actually peaceful before 1914 and suddenly became warlike. There'd been wars in the Balkans in 1912 and 1913. There'd been a steady series of small wars in the 19th century. There'd been colonial wars.
But because one of the charges against the revisionist historian movement is that they tend to present the what-if version of history, which, and many have argued, it could have been avoided. But then there's obviously the other view, which is, of course, it did happen, and it's wrong to question what happens if it didn't happen, because that's not the job of a historian. But then there's also the argument, well, it was inevitable. There's almost a fatalism in some historical writings that, well, this was always going to happen when you analyse the tensions of the time.
I think you're quite right. What if this war hadn't happened? What event might have sparked a similar war a year or two later? Were European societies aware enough of the fact that they might plunge themselves into this sort of catastrophe to avoid it? I don't think they were. They tried between the wars to avoid a repeat, but they failed to do so. And even today, although we can avoid the global wars, we hope, but we don't avoid war or small localized wars. This is a part of human nature and international affairs.
On the question of historians and the public, do you feel, I mean, obviously you've said that there's a very clear role for historians in relation to public knowledge, but do you feel historians are meeting the challenges they're meant to in relation to the public? Do you feel it's being done? For example, if we looked at a few months ago, they had Neil Ferguson on Channel 4, I think, or was it BBC or Channel 4, one of the two, where he was presenting the argument against going to war and the fact it was inevitable. And then you had Max Hastings presenting the other argument.
I think what representations like that suggest is actually the history is not fixed. History does change down the generations, and the academic engagement with the First World War over the last 25 years has been very different from what you might call the more journalistic engagement of the previous 25 years. And before that, it was the memoirs of those who fought. So we do see history being rewritten every generation. And I think the role of historians during the centenaries is to present the current consensus, even though there'll never be a fixed history of the First World War. It is a large, contentious, significant event that history is changing as we find out more about it. We don't actually really know a great deal about the First World War yet.
Do we really have an accurate understanding, though, of what the politicians who were making the decisions back in 1914 understood were about to happen? Because one of the things when you look through the First World War, and particularly when it was about to break out, you have people like Winston Churchill talking about their excitement that the war is coming, but that also suggests a certain how cut off they were, or a certain naivety, or at least that's how it looks. Do you feel, though, based on what you've researched at the time, that they really did understand what was about to happen?
No, not really. Their images of war were 19th century or even 18th century in certain respects. Winston Churchill had been a soldier himself. He'd fought small-scale colonial wars. He'd been a war journalist. He had not, nor had European societies, engaged in this sort of mass attritional industrialized warfare, which essentially involved putting huge numbers of men in military uniforms and engaging them in huge, long, bloody battles in order to see essentially who emerged the last man standing. That's the strategy of the First World War. It's harsh to put it that way, but essentially that's what happens when you mobilize mass armies and commit them to a struggle over deeply felt issues, which we must see World War I in that perspective in the same way that we see World War II. It was a war that the societies believed had to be fought and were committed to seeing through to victory one way or another.
What do you think is the biggest misconception about the First World War?
This idea that it was futile. It certainly was not futile to those who were fighting it. We always view it now through the lens of World War II, and that suggests that World War I did not achieve anything because of the consequences of World War II. In fact, what World War I did, I wouldn't call it an achievement, what it did was it changed geopolitics from the 19th century structures, but nothing concrete was put in their place, and in some ways we've been fighting the legacy conflicts of World War I throughout the 20th and now into the 21st century.